A helpless puppy lay trembling after being dumped on the road. Stallone rushed to save it, but what happened after shocked everyone. Los Angeles was quiet that night, but not quiet enough to hide cruelty. Sylvester Stallone was driving home, his thoughts lost somewhere between the past and the present. The roads were empty, the glow of the streetlight stretching into the distance. Then, just as he approached an intersection, something happened that made his stomach twist. Up ahead, a black sedan slowed down near the curb, not stopping, just hesitating. Stallone's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched. A few seconds passed, then the passenger window rolled down. And then, it happened. A small bundle was tossed out like garbage. No hesitation, no second thought. The car door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped off, its taillights disappearing into the night. Stallone's foot slammed the brakes before his brain could even register the full horror of what he had just seen. His heart pounded as he threw the door open and ran toward whatever had been left on the pavement. His instincts screamed at him, telling him what it was before he even got there. A puppy. A tiny, helpless thing, shivering in the cold. It wasn't moving. Stallone's breath hitched as he knelt beside it, afraid of what he might find. The puppy's fur was dirty, its little ribs visible through its thin coat. It made the weakest whimper, a sound so faint, so broken, it nearly shattered him. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched. He had seen fights, had taken hits, had fought through pain most people couldn't imagine. But this was something else. Gently, he scooped the tiny body into his arms, wrapping it in his jacket. The puppy flinched at first, but was too weak to resist. He felt its rapid, unsteady heartbeat against his palm. How long had it been hungry? How long had it been waiting for someone to care? He wasn't going to waste another second. He rushed back to his car, gripping the wheel with one hand, the other cradling the trembling creature against his chest. Whoever had done this had sped away. But Stallone? He was about to race for this puppy's life. The engine roared as Stallone sped through the empty streets, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had driven fast before, chasing deadlines, catching flights, rushing to film sets. But this was different. This time, a life was slipping away in his hands. The tiny body in his jacket barely moved. He could feel the weak rise and fall of its chest, each breath so faint it made his heart pound harder. The puppy let out another whimper, softer this time, as if it didn't even have the strength to cry anymore. He wasn't going to let this be its last night. "Stay with me, buddy. Just hold on," he muttered, pushing the car harder. His mind raced. Was it in shock? Was it bleeding internally? Had it been starving for days? The thought made his jaw clench. Whoever had done this hadn't just been cruel. They had left it to die. As soon as the red neon sign of the emergency vet clinic came into view, he cut across the nearly empty parking lot and threw the car into park. He was out of the driver's seat before the engine even had a chance to settle, cradling the fragile body against his chest as he rushed toward the entrance. The receptionist's eyes widened the moment he stormed through the door. She recognized him instantly, but this wasn't about who he was. This was about who he was holding. "I need help. Now," Stallone said, his voice firm but urgent. A vet tech rushed over, taking the puppy from his arms with gentle hands. The moment it left his grip, he felt an odd emptiness, like he had just let go of something more than fur and bones. They laid the puppy on the exam table, and the vet quickly checked its pulse, shining a small light into its barely open eyes. "Severely dehydrated. Underweight. We'll get fluids in him immediately," she said. Then, as she felt along its tiny body, her expression darkened. "There's a fracture in the hind leg," she added, her tone careful, like she was bracing him for bad news. "It's going to be a rough recovery, but he's a fighter." Stallone exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Fighter. That word meant something to him. His fists had won battles. His strength had carried him through impossible times. But right now, all the fight in the world wouldn't matter if this puppy didn't make it. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside the table, eyes locked on the small, struggling life before him. He wasn't leaving, not until he knew this little one had a chance. The clinic was silent except for the steady hum of machines and the occasional rustle of papers. Stallone sat beside the small exam table, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. His eyes never left the tiny body lying in front of him. The puppy's breathing was still shallow, its small chest rising and falling unevenly. The vet worked quickly, inserting an IV into the fragile front leg, a tiny bag of fluids hanging from the stand beside them. "We're stabilizing him," she said gently. "But he's weak, and his body's been through a lot." Stallone nodded, but his jaw was clenched. Weak? This little guy had been tossed onto the street like garbage and was still holding on. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. The minutes stretched into hours. The fluids started doing their job, giving the puppy just enough strength to let out a small, raspy breath. It wasn't much, but it was something. A flicker of life in a body that had been so close to losing the fight. Stallone leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "You're not giving up. Not now. You hear me?" His hand hovered over the tiny paw, careful not to cause any more pain. "You got people rooting for you already, kid." The vet tech glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're really staying?" "Yeah," he said without hesitation. "He's not alone in this." It wasn't the first time Stallone had felt this kind of helplessness. He had been here before, in a different way, in a different lifetime. Sleeping on a bench with nothing in his pockets, feeling like the world had no place for him. Back then, the only thing he had was a dog that never left his side. Butkus had seen him at his lowest, had curled up next to him on nights when he had nothing to offer but his company. And now, here he was, on the other side of it all, sitting in a vet's office with another dog who had been abandoned, left to fight for its life. The vet adjusted the puppy's position slightly, checking his leg again. "We'll need x-rays soon, but right now, rest is what he needs most." Stallone exhaled, watching as the tiny body settled under the soft towel they had draped over it. The worst part was knowing the puppy didn't even understand what was happening. It didn't know it had been saved. It only knew pain, fear, hunger. He rubbed his hands over his face and leaned back in the chair. This wasn't fair. The clinic staff came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medication, whispering updates. Stallone barely heard them. His focus was locked on the puppy. Every time its breathing steadied, he let out a slow breath. Every time it twitched in discomfort, his hands curled into fists. Then at some point past midnight, something happened. The smallest thing, but it nearly brought him to his knees. The puppy moved, not just a twitch or a shiver. It shifted, just barely, adjusting its tiny body as if fighting its way out of sleep. A soft whimper escaped its mouth, followed by the faintest, weakest lift of its head. Stallone sat up straight, his heart pounding. "That's it," he whispered. "Come on, buddy. Keep going." The little body trembled, its nose twitching slightly. And then, it opened its eyes. Clouded with exhaustion, barely able to focus but open. Stallone felt something tighten in his throat. He had seen victories before, had lived through moments that should have been impossible. But this tiny, beaten-down puppy fighting its way back after being thrown away, this was the kind of fight that mattered. He exhaled, a slow smile breaking through the exhaustion. "Told you you were a fighter." The puppy blinked, then let out a soft, tired sigh and closed its eyes again. But this time it didn't look lifeless. This time it looked like it was resting. Safe. And Stallone, for the first time in hours, let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this little one was going to make it. The sun had barely started to rise when Stallone finally stepped outside the clinic, exhaustion settling into his bones. The little fighter inside was stable for now, but his mind refused to rest. He kept seeing that car, that moment when the window rolled down and the tiny, helpless body was tossed like trash onto the cold pavement. It made his blood boil. Who does that? Who looks at a living, breathing creature and decides it's worthless? He wasn't going to let it slide. He pulled out his phone and called a contact, a retired cop he had met years ago. Someone who still had connections. "I need a favor," Stallone said, his voice steady but firm. "There was a car last night, a black sedan. A puppy was thrown out near East Sunset. Any way to check street cameras?" There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." A few hours later, he got a call back. The traffic cameras had caught everything. The make, the model, even the license plate of the car. The footage was clear as day. A man in the passenger seat, arm lazily extended, tossing the puppy without a second glance. As if it was nothing. Stallone's grip tightened around his phone. He had met a lot of tough guys in his life, fought his fair share of battles. But this wasn't toughness. This was cowardice. The police were already on it. Within a day, they tracked down the owner of the vehicle, a man with a history of animal neglect. It wasn't his first time, but this time, the evidence was undeniable. Social media had exploded overnight. The rescue, the security footage, the cruel act caught on tape. People were furious. Pet organizations, shelters, even celebrities spoke out. Animal cruelty charges were pressed immediately. Stallone didn't care about the legal details. He just wanted one thing: justice. And that's exactly what happened. The man was arrested, his name blasted across the news. And the best part? The footage didn't just expose him. It started something bigger. Shelters saw a rise in adoptions. People stepped forward to foster, to rescue, to do better. Donations poured into animal welfare groups. Because one puppy had fought to survive, and one man refused to look away. Stallone sat in the clinic lobby, watching the news unfold on his phone. He looked over at the vet's office, where that tiny pup was still fighting, still holding on. "This world's got a lot of bad people," he murmured. "But it's got good ones too." And he had just proved that the good ones, they still outnumbered the bad. Stallone sat in the small recovery room, watching the tiny fighter sleep. It had been 3 days since that night, the night the puppy had been thrown away like nothing. But now, wrapped in soft blankets, a tiny IV still in its fragile leg, it wasn't nothing anymore. It was a survivor. The vet had given the good news that morning. "He's not just stable," she had said with a smile. "He's strong. He's going to make it." Stallone had heard a lot of things in his life: cheers, applause, victory bells. But those words, those hit different. Now sitting in the quiet, he watched as the puppy shifted slightly, stretching its tiny paws for the first time. It was the smallest movement, but it meant everything. The little body that had once been limp and lifeless was finally showing signs of life. Stallone leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been through hell, kid," he murmured, "but you fought your way back." Then, as if recognizing the voice that had been by its side this whole time, the puppy opened its eyes. Soft brown, unfocused at first, but slowly blinking up at him. For a second, everything else faded. The puppy let out a tiny, raspy whimper, not of fear, but recognition. And that's when Stallone knew. He had told himself he was just saving a life, that once the puppy was better, he'd find it a home. But looking at it now, weak but safe, something in his chest tightened. He thought about Butkus, the only one who had never abandoned him when the world had turned its back. He thought about second chances. His mind had already made the decision before his mouth even opened. "Guess you're stuck with me now, huh?" he muttered, reaching out to gently scratch behind the tiny ears. The puppy tilted its head, licking his fingers once, twice, just enough to say it understood. Later that afternoon, as he signed the adoption papers, the vet smiled. "What are you going to name him?" Stallone glanced at the small bundle curled up in his arms. Warm, safe, home. He exhaled, a soft grin forming. Lucky. Because if there was one thing he knew for sure, it wasn't just the puppy who had been saved that night. It was him too. The world didn't take long to notice. By the time Stallone carried Lucky out of the clinic, a quiet storm was already brewing online. The traffic footage of the abandoned puppy, Stallone's desperate rescue, and the heart-wrenching updates from the clinic had spread faster than anyone expected. At first, it was just a few posts. Sylvester Stallone saves helpless puppy from the street. Then came the news articles. The headlines poured in. Stallone rescues abandoned puppy. His next move left everyone in tears. A puppy was left to die, but Stallone gave it a new life. People couldn't stop talking about it, not just because of who he was, but because of what it meant. This wasn't just another Hollywood feel-good moment. This was real. It was raw, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. Animal shelters saw a surge in adoptions. People lined up to foster rescues, to help, to give second chances. Donations flooded into organizations that had been struggling for years. And then, something even bigger happened. One morning, as Stallone took Lucky for a quiet walk in the park, a little girl ran up to him, clutching her mother's hand. Her eyes were wide, filled with something between excitement and gratitude. "Because of you, my family adopted a puppy from the shelter," she said softly. "We named him Rocky." Stallone looked down at the child, then at Lucky, who wagged his tiny tail, nuzzling into his arms. A small smile tugged at his lips. He knelt, ruffling the girl's hair. "Nah, kid," he said gently. "He saved me." Some stories aren't just about rescue. They're about second chances, love, and kindness that changes lives. Lucky wasn't just saved that night. He found a home, a family, and a future. And this world? It needs more of that. More people willing to stand up, to care, to make a difference. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. And before you go, check out the videos on your screen. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. Thanks for watching, and remember, kindness is the real strength.